feel Jewish today, I feel Syrian today, and both of those feel like a part of my identity by choice as well as by, the upbringing that I had. And both of those things feel important to me and have been things that I've chosen to embrace more as I've gotten older. I was brought up Jewish, and in my 20s, late 20s and 30s when I had my kid, it was something I decided I wanted to be more involved in. And fortunately, I'm married to somebody who is not Jewish, but is happy to have the Jewish traditions in our family. And the Syrian traditions are something I've chosen to be more involved with too, partly through cooking. My grandmother was always an incredible Syrian cook and made the best food in the world. So when I got to be a mom and wanted to bring some of more of that family tradition back into our family, I started gathering a lot of recipes from her and learning them kind of by remote cooking education. But I would say both of those things are things that are important to me inside and outside. I suppose as an insider and as an outsider to some extent. Because of not having been brought up in that big Syrian community, I would say it's part of my identity, but it'd be hard for me to say that it's a really integral part of my identity like it is for my cousins that grew up in that community. I think being Jewish in America, you can move to a new city and join a synagogue and be involved in some Jewish activities and people consider you Jewish. But if you're Syrian Jewish, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more ornate than that because it's much more about being part of a real extended community with all of their traditions and foods and prayers and ways of praying and ways of observing and ways of raising their children. It's much more than just sort of declaring an identity. So it's a part of me from different angles. I would have to say if I hadn't written this book, I probably would not be reacting really differently to those events from how other people react to them in America. They're horrific. It's considered the most dangerous place on earth right now, I've heard reports. And probably not very differently from how I react to news that I hear of crises going on in other parts of the world, because our family's connection with Syria really was not a connection with the place of Syria, or if it was, that was broken long before the family stories that I heard. I even recently, in talking to some of my family members, my uncles, I asked them, did you ever have a longing, was there any nostalgia to go back to Syria? Was there any sense of nostalgia for the place of Syria? And it was a flat out no. I think the circumstances of leaving were so dramatic and traumatic and so unequivocal that there was no sense that they might be able to go back under some circumstances. And that's the sense that I grew up with. So I don't think I really would have had any sense of stronger attachment to what investment in what's going on in Syria if I hadn't written this book. Because the research that I did made me so fascinated by the place, specifically Aleppo and its history in place in Jewish history and as a place of culture for thousands of years. So to think now about what might be happening to some of those places, those buildings, I can't say it's in any way equivalent to the tragedy of what's happening to the people, but I would still feel terribly upset to learn that the Great Synagogue was destroyed, that the souk was destroyed, that the citadel was destroyed. And I think that the status of these historical buildings and places, we don't know and may not know for a long time what the outcome will be to them. So I think my sense of loyalty to Syria is maybe even stronger than some of my family members. And it's not loyalty to Syria, it's just a sense of the tragedy of what's being lost there, even though we don't personally have family members there now. That's a great relief, but still I think my feeling of the tragedy of what's being lost there, as I say, it's not at all equivalent to the loss of life, to lose those historical buildings, but it's still something I would feel was a real tragedy if they were destroyed. The book I think I was most affected by was not a book about the Middle East and not a book about Jews. It was The Reign of Gold by Victor Villaseñor, the man who wrote about his family coming to America from Mexico. Just an amazing book that I read actually long before I started working on this book, probably, or at least first read it when it first came out. And it's such an amazing collection of, I mean, he did extraordinary research of Mexican history and just probably bazillions of hours of interviews with his family members and wove it together into this irresistible narrative that's so much fun to read that I think, boy, that was the type of thing that I wanted to get a little wind under my wings from. Initially, they were probably very similar to the general pattern of experiences of immigrants. Most of my family members came to America with, certainly my father came to America with almost nothing. I mean, with, knowing some people here, having some family that could help him get established a little bit, but really coming here to put down the foothold for the rest of the family and to start over, to make a new start. So I think in that sense, it's very typical of immigrant experiences in America. But I think 50 years later for him, 50, 60 years later, 100 years later from when our family first started coming here, or when the Syrian Jews first started coming here, and when my grandmother on my mother's side of the family, when he first came as a child, in that sense, the experience is really, really different, really unique and different from other immigrants because of the steadfastness of that Syrian community and how they maintain traditions from centuries. And they amaze me in that regard. I talk about that in the book, that when I visit my relatives in New York, when they come visit, I feel like I'm seeing the future. I mean, they're the most cutting edge in their dress, in their style, in the cars they drive, the technology they have. I mean, they're cutting edge American on the outside, on the surface, on all the presentation aspects of them, but in the way they live, in the way they pray, in the way they observe within their family, the way they name their children, the way the children are raised, that is so much more Syrian Jewish than American, that I think in that regard they're really unique as an immigrant group. Definitely there are aspects of that old culture that are still a part of me. Again, not nearly as much as for my cousins that were raised in that tight-knit community in New York. But it's still fascinating for me to see. First of all, I mean, when I was growing up, even though we weren't raised in New York, in the big community, we were raised, as I describe it in the book, as our little satellite Syrian community. My grandmother on my mother's side, grandparents, and my cousins on my mother's side, we lived all really close to one another in Maryland. And we got together at my grandmother's house every Sunday. And she cooked for us and the kids played together. And, it's interesting to me to see all of my cousins now and siblings to some extent still cook those foods in our houses because they're so good and they bring back such memories and they're a part of our lives. So, and I think there's another thing that's harder for me to put into words, but I think there's a personality trait of the Syrian Jews that I see in myself. And I think that the separateness that I describe, that I feel really strongly because of having grown up away from Brooklyn, to some extent I think all of the Syrian Jews have some kind of quality trait like that. They've come to America and still maintained this really tightly defined identity within this broader identity and context of being American. In Syria, they had all those hundreds of years of maintaining a Jewish identity within a predominantly Muslim country for most of that time. So I think that's a hard one for me to answer, but I do think there's some outward things that I certainly still feel influenced by, and something in, maybe a personality trait of the culture, some sort of thread that runs through. I'm still working on that one, so that's my best for now. That's a really complicated question, and I feel really mixed about it. I feel when I visit those relatives, there's a part of me that feels fascinated by it, sort of drawn to that close-knit world that they have. It's very supportive of one another. They take care of the elderly, take care of the sick. I'm sure there's a shadow side to it that you don't see just as a visitor there on vacation. You know, insularity, I think, always has a dark side, and I think I know better than to think that I could just move there and be a part of that world. I think I really would have had to have been brought up in that world to feel comfortable in that kind of close-knit lifestyle, which is so much more communally defined than the mainstream American, which is so much more individually identified. I don't think I could just graft myself into that world at this point without having been brought up in it. And maybe even then. I mean, I think I do have some relatives who I know were brought up in that community that still felt it was too insular. They had to get away. It didn't fit for them. In terms of how it works for the community and how they, because I think that's the other part of your question, I think it works for the community in the sense that, boy, they are rock solid. They are not in danger of being absorbed into mainstream America, losing their identity. I think that's a struggle, a temptation and a struggle that all ethnic groups have when they come to America, all immigrant groups. They want to become American. They also want to maintain their identity that they came here with. And usually a couple generations later, it's a really difficult struggle. The kids are being brought up in American schools. They're learning English. You know, they've kind of lost much of their identity from the old country, whatever it was. This community, they're not losing it. They're gaining in numbers. There's not a lot of assimilation. There's not a lot of intermarriage outside of the community. You know, for them, it's really working. I really think. For the greater culture of America, that's a really hard one. Because I don't think there's a lot, I mean, there are a few. Actually, when I think about it, there are a couple of people from the Syrian Jewish community that are known names in American culture that have contributed to American culture, but by and large, they keep within. So are they contributing to the broader American society? Boy, I'd have to say, you know, in a lot of ways, yes. In a lot of ways, not as palpably and measurably as other cultural groups, perhaps. But you know, then it loops back around again for me, because I think groups come to this country, we are built of immigrants. And so I think there's a strength to this country to maintaining different identities throughout the country of different immigrant groups, not just all becoming, you know, you take all these different colors of paint and you mix them all together and you get sort of a mucky brown, you know. If you keep some of your individual colors, I think that is a good thing for the greater American culture too.